I think Gary Neville thought that no one would mention this, and if they did, it would just be sort of fairly light-hearted. It was just like he sort of lay down and said, "Oh, here's the goal." I was slightly shocked that he didn't have anything. I heard the news when I was in makeup about to go on and do Have I Got News For You. We were literally about to do a recording at 7, and then the BBC said at 6:30 the Queen's died, "You're not doing it." And part of me was furious because I thought, I've always got something to say. And then part of me probably thought, perhaps give it a week. And I might have something more sensible to say. I think bottom of the barrel is my theme of the year, and we hit the bottom, the absolute bottom. And it was just worse than everyone could possibly have imagined.
Ian Hislop, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah.
Well, good.
Yeah, it's about as good as I can do. No, it's been quite a year, really.
Yeah, pretty extraordinary. We are talking because, enter the prop, the Private Eye Annual.
The Private Eye Annual, which is meant to be a collection of everything that's happened in the year, but given the speed of events, I'm afraid we've missed some.
Yes.
On the end.
3 prime ministers, 2 monarchs, 1 recession.
Yes, European war.
Yes. And 24 issues of Private Eye?
No, I think we did 25 this year.
25.
Yeah, no, we kept going resolutely, no matter how grim the news.
Soldiering on, yeah. It's like a bit of a shit Christmas carol, isn't it? 3 prime ministers, 2 on it, yeah.
Yeah, and Partridge, nay, I don't think you can get that.
How do you think we should do this then? Chronologically, thematically, what do you reckon the best way of approaching 2022 is?
Random?
Yeah, we'll just dip in and out, I don't know what I would go for.
That was certainly the approach of the government, so.
As a theme, I don't know, what would you say? Hubristic? Incompetent?
Yeah, I think bottom of the barrel is my theme of the year. I mean, we've been going there for about 12 years of Tory government, and we hit the bottom, the absolute bottom, and it was just worse than everyone could possibly have imagined.
As I was preparing to do this interview, looking over the year's events, and I think it's quite easy to fall into conceiving or thinking, oh, well, it's all Boris Johnson's fault, or it's all Liz Truss's fault, or it's all Rishi Sunak's fault. And actually, the key phrase there is 12 years. This is a long, you could go further than that, couldn't you? But the decline and the kind of stagnation that we're seeing in the economy to all parts of British civic society, they're long trends, aren't they? It's not just started in the last few months.
No, but I think it was accelerated and everything was made easier. I mean, if you take Boris Johnson as essentially lowering all the standards there are in public life to the bottom, to the point where you fire anyone who doesn't agree with you, you fire any standards, you fire anyone who says it's not a very good idea, you literally get rid of everyone who doesn't say yes, sir, and particularly yes, Brexit, then you've got one government and we think, oh, well, it can't get worse than that. Oh, yes, it can. Yes, it can. You finally get rid of the man who's a, major liar, and is revealed as such. And I mean, I'm very keen that we get the narrative straight, because people are always trying to build a new narrative of, well, he was stabbed in the back because people didn't agree with the policy. It's nothing to do with policy. He was stabbed in the front by all of his ministers, almost the entire government in a day, because they thought his ethical standards were embarrassing. It wasn't that he was a liar, it was that he was a liability. And that's when the Tories kick in and they think, right, we're going to lose now. So suddenly, I mean, the letters of resignation were marvellous. They were the funniest thing of the year. Dear Prime Minister, despite having supported you your entire life, I've suddenly noticed...
Had a change of heart, yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely appalling. So...
or in the space of 24 hours, I've decided I am no longer the right person to be your education secretary.
Exactly. I mean, and Zahawi was fantastic, literally being appointed in the morning and the evening saying, no, I think it's time you went. What? He just appointed you.
Amazing.
So, yeah, we had a wonderful... gift item of a pair of Zahawi flip-flops, which literally you just don't know which foot's going down. So yes, I mean, you're right, it's a long-term trend, but then it accelerated and we got Liz Truss, which Liz Truss is like the apogee of student politics and student economics, and her and her mate Kwasi saying, isn't it great? We debated this when we were 19. Let's do it now. And you think, well, no, even 19-year-olds would say, hang on, I think this is a bit much. But they decided to listen to nobody. I mean, literally nobody.
Extraordinary. Interesting you mentioned there that narrative about stabbing Boris in the back. One of our journalists, Ed Campbell, goes around the country interviewing people, and that narrative is starting to take hold in places. One of the reasons people often give for disliking Rishi Sunak is they say he knifed Boris Johnson. He betrayed Boris Johnson. And you're right, it wasn't. Maybe that was the most high-profile resignation to start things off, but I think it was more than half of the government.
Well, that just seems to me, a real failure of short-term memory. And I've run a number of dementia adverts in Private Eye, specifically aimed at members of the Conservative Party, saying, do you have trouble remembering the events of about 3 weeks ago? Because I can explain them to you. And Rishi Sunak betrayed Boris Johnson too late, much too late. That's his real crime. He wasn't even the first. It was actually Sajid Javid who resigned first, and then Rishi thought, blimey, he's resigned, I'd better resign on principle as well. And then everyone else did. I mean, the betrayal narrative is nonsense. I mean, the person who's good at betraying prime ministers is Boris. He betrayed Theresa May, David Cameron, and then himself. And now he's back on the back benches trying to create trouble for Rishi. Betrayal is not something he can accuse other people of doing. That really is too rich. So I'm very keen that we try and remember these narratives. And I think I probably bored you before, but for Matt Hancock to now say, well, we put a ring of steel around the care homes. Really? Well, it's the weakest steel that there's ever been invented. You didn't put a ring of anything. You let people out of hospital to go into the care homes, and they affected everyone. I mean, why collectively Britain wants to say, yeah, these people, yeah, that's what happened. I mean, you were there.
It's also extraordinary that the kind of mechanism that the British public have had for reconciling with these things has basically been sort of a Corrie actress asking him about it as they eat camel anuses together.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that says about us as a society, that our sort of cathartic national, reconciliation of this deeply traumatic thing is basically sending him onto a reality TV show.
Yes, and I mean, it's the triumph of celebrity, isn't it? But I mean, there is a slight problem with sort of trial by other celebrities around the campfire, is they haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the problems of COVID. Whereas, boring as journalists are, that's sort of what they do. So if Matt Hancock would like to give an interview with some journalists who know what they're talking about, that could happen. Or even, and I know this is silly, but he could turn up in front of the inquiry and explain himself. I mean, he is paid to do that, and he was the health secretary. So explaining yourself in a public forum, we do have them, and they don't involve...
Others are available, yeah.
They don't involve kangaroos' arses.
Perhaps that's good television, yeah.
Well, television has got a very short, attention span. So episode 1, you say, well, what are you doing in here? And episode 2, I say, oh, leave him alone.
Yeah.
Oh, he's all right. He fell in love. Oh, God. I mean, I found that more emetic than any of the bugs, to be honest.
Let's talk big standout moments for you from this year.
Yeah.
If you had to pick a few, some of the most sort of momentous or interesting or things that you immediately remember, what would you say?
Well, I mean, the death of the Queen, which was absolutely extraordinary. Not because a very old woman dies, which isn't extraordinary, but the actual reaction to it, which was terribly sort of impressive. I thought the public were rather marvellous, because we didn't get that complete hysteria. We didn't get that full-on, it's a tragedy, because it wasn't a tragedy, it was something everyone had expected. What people were very sad, and then this being Britain, they decided, how are we going to focus that sadness? We're going to queue up. We're going to queue up for something, which they did. And then, I mean, I was there in the middle of the night watching the queue like anyone else. It was absolutely extraordinary, sort of like a sort of Adam Curtis film or something mesmeric from Scandi TV. It was just quite extraordinary. And then the funeral itself, I thought was, sort of beautifully done. Unlike, I should imagine, a lot of people, I thought, gosh, that first anthem is really good. He's excellent. That may not have been everyone's takeaway, but, one's allowed to like what one likes, and I thought that music was terrific. And I did think there was a sort of a general reaction of consideration and of what have we lost, what was the point of this? And people who don't want a monarchy, fine. You know, a bad moment was when the bloke who shouted at Andrew in the procession got hassled by the police. But then the backlash was phenomenal. You know, people saying, we're allowed to shout "you're a nonce" at Prince Andrew. That's pretty much what a constitutional monarchy means. And I agree with that.
It's the First Amendment of the British Constitution. Yeah. No,
so that seemed perfectly reasonable. And a lot of it just seemed to me rather extraordinary. So that was very standout. And sort of part of me, I mean, I heard the news when I was in makeup about to go on and do Have I Got News For You. We were literally about to do a recording at 7, and then the BBC said at 6:30 the Queen's died, you're not doing it. And part of me was furious because I thought I've always got something to say. And then part of me probably thought, perhaps give it a week, and I might have something more sensible to say. Which what happened. So yes, I mean that was extraordinary, and I mean, Britain is the most peculiar place, you know, which is one of the reasons I do rather like it. And I waste lots of my time trying to criticise it and analyse ways in which it could be run better. People always at royal moments, they say, well, you're not very patriotic, are you? And you go, well, I am, but it's not expressed in the same way as you. But that's all right. So I was thrilled by Paddington. I thought, that's pretty funny. We've spent my adult life people saying, no one knows what the Queen's got in her handbag. You know, everyone's parents will say, oh, nobody knows what's in the Queen's handbag. She does the joke. So, oh, it's got sandwiches in it. I mean, it's pretty funny.
I think the truest form of patriotism is a criticism of one's country, because it comes from a place of wanting it to be better. You know, the flag waving, the pageantry, all of that has a place, don't get me wrong, but I think it's quite a shallow form of patriotism, right? Versus criticism, engagement, ways to improve. I think that's the place of true patriotism. Liz Truss has a place in that story as well, doesn't she? Because in the extraordinary 45 days that she was Prime Minister, she announces the death of the Queen outside Downing Street. At the funeral, she does this incredibly lacklustre reading. And I look forward to the history lessons of the future, school children sort of saying, who's that teacher, who's that woman doing the oh, that's Britain's shortest serving Prime Minister.
Yes, who is that? That's Lady Jane Grey. That's the person you've forgotten was ever on the throne. That's the person. No, I mean, it was, I think we will remember it as a bad dream. And my overall impression of Liz Truss is that she couldn't believe she was Prime Minister. You know, the rest of us shared that particular problem. But it was delusional. And, you know, I mean, quite staggering in watching how in a modern economy, how fast the theory of British exceptionalism falls over by people who are its proponents. Someone who's spent her adult life saying, oh, you've got to trust the markets. Oh my God, the markets! They've shafted us. Yeah, they have. And they said they would. And the idea that, you know, we act as a sort of separate state that has no bearing and no interest and no relationships with other people is crazy. I mean, my problem was that everybody I know who knows anything about anything said this won't work. You know, not left-wingers, right-wingers, and just anybody. Anybody who does a bit of money, who has a vague idea about this stuff.
Anyone with a fiver in their pocket.
No, you can't do that. So what? Labour says we tax and spend. You now say we spend and then we give away tax. Oh, that is new. How do we do that? Oh, we just borrow. So we just borrow. Right. And who lends us the money? Oh, people, other... No, you see, those other people are abroad, a lot of them, and they look at Britain and think, no, I don't think we will lend you the money. And it's not hard. I mean, it's just so not hard.
I think the key word, one of the key words you used there was delusional. There's, for me anyway, there's this ever-widening gap between reality and sort of, well, either political, I guess you could call it fantasy role play in the case of Liz Truss, I don't know, but she spends the summer talking about this radical policy programme. It was radical, right? You know, the ideas that she was talking about, changing the economy and all the rest of it, and then they come into contact with reality and just fall apart. And I wonder what it says about our politics that someone is allowed to or able to espouse those ideas and actually progress, to the top of the pile in British politics. And it's as if no one's ever stopped, or at least anyone who could stop her getting there, and said, actually, this just won't work.
Yeah.
They've bought into the fantasy of it.
Well, I think that's right. And I think it's a structural failing in that they managed to whittle this race down to two people, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, and this tiny Conservative Party electorate. So most people have no say on what goes on. But there's two Conservative candidates, right? One of them is saying, I can do all these marvellous things and I can borrow money and whatever. The other one is saying it's going to be a disaster and it'll go very badly wrong. Now, the one of them who's saying it's going badly wrong is a Goldman Sachs banker who's known to be quite right-wing and is Brexit. He's not a raving libtard, woke liberal North Londoner, Rishi Sunak, is he? No, really?
Not at all.
So for the Conservative Party to entirely ignore the views of the person who's sort of pretty much their man in order to go for, and I think it's Trumpian. I think it's a sort of, I would like to believe whatever I want now, so I'm going to vote for what I think. No, not even what I think, what I feel. It's whoever said it was Trump is an assault on reality. That's his politics. And I think we imported that briefly and decided that the Conservative Party decided reality wasn't important. But unfortunately, and actually I think maybe fortunately, reality came back.
The feel is so important because, like you said, Rishi Sunak, Silicon Valley guy, hawkish, a Brexiteer since day one.
Yeah.
Basically as right-wing can be in British politics, and also one of the richest men to ever have sat in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
On the other, Liz Truss, student Lib Dem, campaigns as a Remainer, and yet, for some reason, the Conservative Party comes to the conclusion that she feels more right-wing than Rishi, even if you were to just put their credentials down on paper and separate. So you go, well, that guy is obviously the leader of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, obviously.
But it was just almost about the vibes of the two of them, where he kind of projects perhaps with more metropolitan energy than Liz Truss maybe did.
And I was I was interested at the time. I thought, is this a racism problem? But then when Sunak became British Prime Minister, it almost passed without comment.
Yeah.
It was Diwali. So his kids had it out. So that was about it. I mean, I found that terribly cheering, I have to admit, that it didn't seem to be a big problem. And the one person on a radio who says you're not British followed it with the sentence saying you're American, because he looks a bit, there was the problem with his green card, and he did look as though he'd rather be an American at one stage of his life. But the racism element didn't seem to me there. So I think what voting for Liz Truss meant for them is, you are exactly right. It was a fantasy of a right-wing person should look like this, and the rhetoric should be this. And if you want silly, then you got silly. I mean, she was a silly figure, from putting on the Thatcher clothes and putting on the fur hat and
riding a tank
and saying we'll fight Russia to the bitter end. We're not fighting them at all. We're not in this war. We're helping out and we're going and doing the photo ops and doing our best, but we're not fighting in this war. It's not really up to us when it ends. All that posturing I found embarrassing. And then from foreign policy, where posturing is embarrassing but wasn't absolutely critical, she did it in the economy, and there it comes up against this brick wall. So I do think we had our big delusional moment.
We started talking about Liz Truss because we were talking about the Queen. So I've got a few more questions about the royal family. One is the broader role, I guess, of constitutional monarchy, because I think the death of the Queen, and I think we probably haven't actually moved out of it yet, but once the period of mourning and the dust is settled, inevitably it's going to lead to questions about the role of the monarchy in our society. Perhaps not necessarily in Britain. I think Australia, very definitely, they're going to start asking that question. Do you think her death, and perhaps even Charles as monarch, increases the likelihood of Britain moving towards perhaps becoming a republic? How do you think it changes our relationship with the monarchy?
I think it reminded people how a constitutional monarchy had been effective in certain ways, particularly with the personality of the Queen, and it was the longevity, the sense of security, the sense that even if our politics is terrible, at least we have the Queen, and that was a bulwark, and that's one of the things that constitutional monarchies can do. And when Johnson tries to prorogue Parliament, or suddenly you notice the executive power getting completely out of hand in Britain, there is a feeling that, well, at least the Queen is there, at least the armed forces have an oath of allegiance to the Queen and not to Liz Truss. These things can be very comforting.
When you put it like that, it's very comforting.
And I do put it like that. And I think, yes, that makes me feel better. So I think we will get to a period, and I think the Commonwealth, I think a lot of members of the Commonwealth will decide that, that period of history is over and they will go their own way. And I'm sure that will happen, and fine. Whether Charles can maintain the case for a constitutional monarchy and pass that onwards, it's slightly up to the next generation, I think. At the moment, I think he's in a honeymoon period. He's in a period of grace, as it were, to see what happens, and the coronation will be multi-faith. And he, compared to a lot of people of his generation, he was very green very early, and he does say a lot of those things. I mean, had he been allowed, for example, to go to the COP summit, I think that would have been good, because the Tory party could have sent someone who believes all this, what they call green crap. He could actually have gone and meant it, and that might have been quite useful. So I still think there are things that could be useful. I don't know how the soap opera with the younger generation will play out.
That row you mentioned there about the COP conference, will he go, won't he go, is illustrative, I think, because the way you always thought of the Queen was that she was kind of above those sort of squabbles, or if there was any prospect of that discussion happening in the national press, action would be taken to stop it from happening, because I think she was very clever in trying to engineer herself to be above these things at all times. Do you sense that there's a change there with Charles, because he is becoming involved in discussions like that, and they are happening publicly?
I think, yes, I think there is a change, but I think if he's sensible, he will restrict it to one thing. And that being the one thing that really might matter. And I think he would get away with that. I think being a Green King would be a very smart move for the future. A king who's really interested in low traffic developments in cities, no, don't bother with that. A king who's really, really interested in onshore versus offshore, no, don't do that. But generally being
planning laws.
Don't do all that. Certainly don't take bags full of cash from Arab donors to fund your projects. I don't think we want to see any of that. Those things are fairly
obvious.
Like
a handbook, couldn't you?
Yeah, no.
First day in the job.
These things are never very hard, deal with the Harry and Andrew problem.
Yes, Andrew was your first cover this year, wasn't he?
Was he?
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yeah, he was. No, well, yeah. Can you find out somewhere? Consult the annual.
Oh yeah, no. I always consult the annual. Was this the giving up?
Yes.
Oh right. Good. That was a good joke.
Titles. Yeah. That's how I remember the start of the year. We're going, COVID, PPE contracts, VIP lane, all of this stuff going on, photos of the parties.
Yeah.
And then Andrew renounced his titles the next day. And were you expecting that to be a story? I don't know. You've had your pigs in blankets, and you put down your mince pies, and your first editorial in the private eye. First editorial meeting in the private eye offices this year. Were you thinking Andrew's going to be a big deal? What was kind of on your mind? What were you picturing, or how did that meeting go? Yeah,
no, I think it's because traditionally at that dead New Year period, the story is usually the Queen goes to church, or Kate wears a coat, to go to church.
One of my favourite genres.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are big stories. But this year it was, what are they going to do about him? And that remained a problem. And it remained a problem right throughout the year. In the Jubilee, big church service, there's Andrew. And he's helping his mother down the aisle, making himself centre stage. That's not what anyone wanted. So he became a real problem. And then you add in Harry, and they're put together. It's probably a bit unfair. Harry's done. He's had a few court cases with the Mail on Sunday, but it's not quite the same. And so there's that other problem, which won't go away because there's. And I do like the idea. The media can't get enough of this, but family squabbles. You don't need the press, as we all know. If you want to have a fight with your siblings for 30 years, lots of people do it.
Yeah.
If you want to be really cross with your parents your entire life, you don't need the press to help.
Don't need the Netflix camera crew for that. Yeah.
No, that is all going on. I don't see how you end it, certainly from the Sussex's point of view, because they have one commodity, which is unhappiness, bitterness, grudge about what happened in the brief period when they're a member of the royal family, and then Harry extends that to the rest of his life. If that's all you've got to sell, then the argument is going to go on and on.
Let's talk Russia and Ukraine.
Yes.
Something perhaps slightly more serious and important
definitely.
than those guys. February, March time, we wake up in the morning to hear the sound of tanks sort of crossing into Europe. My God, what is going on? How's it got to this point? I was surprised by it. Again, I'm not the most observed of Russian observers, but it felt like I wasn't the only one. It felt like a lot of our, policymakers, government, journalists even were taken by surprise about this happening. Why do you think there was some kind of strategic weakness there, structural problem? I guess this ties into the conversation we're having more broadly about decline and whether or not Britain is the place that it was once on the world stage. But what is it about Britain, if there is anything, that made us blind to this weak spot, that this was forthcoming in Russia? Because with hindsight, it seems pretty obvious that was what was about to happen. Yeah,
I think we're back to believing what you want to believe on both sides. Yeah. And I think on Putin's side, he has convinced himself and been advised over the years that the West isn't interested. It's been weak, it's been pathetic. Russia can act as it wants to. It can act boldly. And his dreams of going back to a sort of Tsarist Russia and re-establishing a set of frontiers, the Greater Russia, are viable. Now, the people who've been telling him that must have known that the Russian army is not up to that. They must have known that those tanks would break down, that most of the people wouldn't fight, that the stuff wouldn't work, and that this 3-week rollover in which no one died and everyone raised the flag, and the Ukrainians were thrilled. You say Western intelligence failed. Well, let's have a look at Russian intelligence. Literally, he believed complete garbage, and he told complete garbage to the Russian population. So you had that going on one side. On the other side, we had the West believing what it wants to believe, which is that Russia isn't a threat, that, Crimea, it was a bit of a one-off. And basically we want to carry on in the way we are doing, particularly with Nord Stream and particularly with the dependence on Russian fuel. And it's a modern world. You're not going to have tanks across borders. You're not going to have people shelled in their houses in Europe. It's not going to happen. So I think both sides believed entirely the wrong thing about themselves. And it's a tragedy. It ties into some of the talking points that we're discussing here, the systemic decline and also the fantasies, because, the UK, previous to the situation we're in now, we had 10 years to borrow cheap money to invest in, let's say, nuclear power plants. But instead, the British government has just gone around nixing them, vetoing them, stopping them from being built. Or, like you said, the fantasy of... Or gas storage. Yes, completely. Why do we have no gas storage? Oh, yeah, we sold it all. Yeah. Oh, that was wise then. Liquefied fuel plants. All these things we're not invested in because we thought life without borders. I mean, the same fantasy that says Britain must stand alone and must be self-sufficient goes hand in hand with the view that no, we'll import food, we'll import fuel. It's fine. That's how it works now. And then it all judders to a halt.
It was the terrifying aspect of it for me was that war in Europe. Who do the people of Western Europe look to for leadership? And it's Boris Johnson is the one on the helicopter to Kyiv. Oh dear God, what on earth is going to happen here? And I thought for a period of time as well that it could potentially have saved him when all of the Partygate stuff was swirling around him. And there's nothing like a good war, right? To boost yourself in the polls.
And he more or less, whenever there was a problem at home, he got on a plane. And, I don't blame Zelensky. He shook his hand and says, "You're marvellous, we love Boris." And then, when Liz Truss turned up, shook her hand and said, "Yeah, you're great." Sunak turns up, "Great, you're great." Yeah, he needs some allies. And I would have to say that, Ben Wallace, who was the Defence Secretary, did do a good job early on. We were ahead Britain in terms of commitment, particularly in those sort of specialist missile areas and the things that Britain still can do quite well. So, I mean, I don't think there's any embarrassment in it. It's just the idea that somehow we're leading the free West. We're there, but Zelensky sort of single-handed. I mean, it is an extraordinary performance from any leader, really anywhere. To turn himself round from a comic figure who wasn't even that popular beforehand to someone who has made Putin look a complete fool. But that we learnt over the course of the year. I've been watching Adam Curtis's absolutely brilliant series on Russia. And I have to say, as usual, I find that my recommendation for everything would just be more history. Once you've watched them, I'm going into Chechnya in a war that everyone said don't go there. Russian mothers ended up going to the front trying to get their sons back off the recruiting sergeants for this totally pointless, devastating, hopeless, ill-equipped war, which, I mean, they've already done this once in living memory. And the faults and the problems and the arguments are all the same. And again, I think we just didn't note what was going on.
That Curtis documentary is fantastic. And actually, I would encourage viewers of the channel as well to check out our interview with Adam from a couple of months ago. Fascinating.
Oh, right, yeah.
He's incredible.
He is brilliant. But is it called Traumatology?
Trauma Zone.
Trauma Zone.
Yeah, brilliant.
Is just fantastic. And if you're going to watch one very, very long documentary about Russia, that's the one.
Make it that one, yeah. It is long. It's interesting you talk about Chechnya because I think you can interpret Putin's behaviour if you look at Chechnya or Georgia or initially in Crimea, Litvinenko, Salisbury. He takes these extraordinary gambles. Yeah. Whether it's invading countries or using chemical weapons on the streets of another nation. And until now, he's broadly gotten away with it.
Yeah.
With the Salisbury poisonings, really, what serious repercussions, but a few sanctions, nothing massive. He's poisoning Britons on the streets of our cities. And I think you can understand how emboldened he was to do something like roll the tanks towards Kyiv.
Yeah.
Because up until that point, he'd been able to do basically whatever he wanted.
Yeah. And if you just think, well, what sort of a world power was Britain where Putin could murder our citizens on the streets? Yeah. I mean, he wasn't just knocking off oligarchs who he didn't approve of. I mean, this was just murdering people and sort of taking the piss. I mean, the Russian foreign policy doing jokes about poisoning, live on telly. It's as though they literally didn't care because they thought, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is, we didn't do anything at all. And, one of the main thrusts of our jokes in the annual really is saying, should we allow oligarchs to buy houses like number 10 Downing Street? Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to buy that particular property in Britain because it'd be better if we owned that. And that was a running theme. I mean, the Conservative Party took a staggering amount of money and allowed the Russians extraordinary liberties in London, in the city, and then throw up their hands and said, "You've no idea what's going on. Have you seen London? I mean, the place is awash with money." Yeah, it is.
Do you think London's role as sort of like a laundromat, butler, it's been called butler to the world, butler to Russia, do you think that influenced the way we treated Russia, or were kind of caught sleeping a little bit, the way that, they store their cash by buying London property, the way they send their children here for an education, or that they donate to our political parties? Do you think that was one of the reasons why perhaps the Conservative government was more relaxed about Russia than perhaps it should have been?
Yeah, I love your questions, which just the answer is yes, of course.
It's really easy. It's really easy.
I really like coming on this. I mean, and I suppose that's the problem, because it seems so bloody obvious to everyone. One of my, mine and Richard Brooks, who writes all our stuff about that, his main point is, why do you think they give all this money? Do you think they do it for fun?
Yeah.
No, they do it because it works.
Yeah.
If you have a whole strata of British society which is involved in processing Russian money and doing well out of it, then the pressure will be to leave them alone. And that's what happens. And then, for all of us journalists, it's they then sue when you point this out. And, some very good and very bold journalists and people who've written books about Russian money laundering had to fight them off.
Yeah.
They don't have to now, because everyone's, oh, yes, Russia, yes, of course, yes, we know that, they're very bad. But that wasn't the view.
It's one of the things that attracts Russian money to London, so it's so popular, is because we have some of the most restrictive libel laws in the where there is this standard of living. We have some of the most restrictive libel laws, and it enables them to basically use their money and resources to sue people into silence. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
One little quote from Boris Johnson straight off the plane from Kyiv, which I thought, it touches on many of the things we're talking about today. "We have made the long-term decisions, including on domestic energy supply, to ensure that our bounce back can and should be remarkable, and that our future will be golden." Which just displays that's this detachment from reality, isn't it? That just kind of seems to permeate all the way through this year.
And again, it's what they used to call boosterism, which was, isn't it great, Boris talks everything up. At a certain point, it isn't great, because it's what they call a lie. It's not an optimistic view, it's just something that isn't true. And the British public, are not children. I mean, I suppose this is half the irritation of living here, is people are saying to you, look, things are really, really bad, but there'll be no pain for any of you, and we'll cut your taxes and you'll be really happy. If things are really, really bad, they're going to be bad. Nobody said during the 50s, austerity, it'll be over very, very quickly. It wasn't, because we just come out of the war. It's not as though there's never a period where you say to the British people, this is what's happening. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have noticed there's a war on, and people say, oh, well, you can't blame the war on everything. But I think most people had no idea that, for example, the grain harvest, huge amounts of the world are dependent on this country, who we haven't noticed much, having a big harvest. And this kicked into everything, food prices everywhere. Yeah. So it is important, and the cost of living crisis started with fuel bills. That's where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dominic Cummings suggested that Liz Truss was a Trojan horse for Boris Johnson, that she was going to go in, self-immolate, and then obviously clear the way for him to recontest the Tory party leadership. Yeah. First of all, do you think that's credible? And second of all, what do you think it says about Boris Johnson that he might entertain an idea like that?
I think that's probably exactly what Boris thought. I mean, his utterly graceless and remorseless resignation, in which he didn't say sorry, he didn't apologise for what he'd done. He said that the party were a herd who just move about. He was rude to everyone and everything, and behind the scenes attempted to stop Rishi Sunak getting the job, and he supported Liz Truss, and that gives you some idea of Boris's judgment. And perhaps he did think, because he is, a fantasist, and one of those irritating fantasists whose silliest dream came true. They're the worst type of fantasists. They really, really are grim. But anyway, he probably thought, yes, I can do it. But for me, one of the pleasures of the year was was his return from holiday. I mean, you notice he was on holiday.
Yeah.
I mean, he's sitting MP, couldn't possibly have actually been doing his job. No, he was on another holiday. Comes back from holiday to say, I've made it, I'm taking over. It's all go, chaps, let's go. Oh, no, it isn't. Thank God for that. And then he says, I've decided not to go ahead because it'd be better for the country. What? When you were on the plane on the way back, it was fine, and now it isn't? What's changed? Oh, you're going to lose. Literally, the self-interest is overpowering. And as I say, just a very brief fit of sense seems to have overcome the Conservative Party.
You mentioned the 50s just a second ago, and I think there's parallels as well perhaps now to the sort of 70s winter of discontent, mass industrial action, the economic situation that we find ourselves in. To what extent do you think what Britain's experiencing now is a cycle? Do you think it's, we've been here before and there'll be another boom after this bust? How do you read, if you're trying to put a bit of historical context on this? What would you say?
I do think we are in the middle of a very specific set of circumstances, and the Ukraine war is a fairly extraordinary one, and the pandemic, which again is quite easy to forget, was a sort of unbelievable major world event, which is still going on, which had enormous economic absolutely vast, and it also had psychological repercussions, because the government essentially, this was a Conservative government, said this is a major problem. We will pay for it. Not you will pay for it. Obviously they've got to pay for it eventually, but we will sort this out. And then once you've said we will sort out the fact that you're not working due to a pandemic, it's very hard for them when the next economic cycle comes around to say, we will not pay for your electricity bill. We will not pay for the fact that your wages haven't gone. So they got themselves into a psychological position, with the public, where being old-fashioned Conservatives, almost impossible. I mean, Tories in my lifetime would say, look, the state doesn't do everything. If your bills have gone up, we don't pay. We're not coming to the supermarket with you. I mean, we don't do that. That's big state. That's socialism. That's not what we do. We're now in a position where they can't do that. And you've also got a generation of people who seem to have forgotten how industrial action works. My generation, obviously, we saw the 70s and the 80s. So people go on strike and they say, we'd like 15%. And you go, that's absolutely appalling. You're not going to get 15%. And then you go away and a few weeks later, they get 11. And then it's over. The current generation, they say, we want 20%. And then the generation of Conservative politicians say, well, you shouldn't be allowed to strike. And that's it. They seem to have no idea that this is part of the history of not only Britain, but the world.
Negotiation.
Negotiation. People ask for more money. You don't necessarily give them all the money, but you give them some of the money. And it just seems to me completely bonkers that they've forgotten how this works.
It's almost, it's that world of the 70s or the 50s, or the world that Orwell kind of satirises in 1984, right? Everything smells a bit of cabbage, nothing works, we just kind of get drunk and that's it, and you get booted in the face over and over again by the country. And it does feel, repetitive. I mean, looking forward then, let's cast our eye forward. What is there to look forward to? Is there anything to look forward to for you or for us more broadly in 2023?
Well, I mean, there's always something to look forward to.
Is there? The next issue of the Private Eye Annual.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the opposite of boosterism is gloomsterism. I mean, in the very last issue of Private Eye, Craig Brown wrote a very funny parody of a programme called You and Yours, which is incredibly depressing on BBC. And it's a commentator saying, so how bad's your Christmas going to be? And someone saying, well, it's quite fun. We've got the relatives. No, you're going to be utterly miserable, aren't you? You're going to be eating cardboard and you're going to have an utterly... No, actually, we're quite looking forward to it. And we might go skating. And then they were going to... And it was quite a useful piece to remind people that public life isn't the only life. Everyone knows about their own lives. And that the failures are repetitive and not exceptional. and living in times where things are grim economically for a lot of people, are depressing but not overwhelming, and that finding things that are done well, things that are still generously and competently managed, still possible, and the fact that if we've hit the bottom, which I think we are bottom of the barreling, no, I think we've done bottom of the barrel, we're just a bit up for it. I think it might well ascend. Ukraine wasn't defeated, and its major cities don't now look like Syria. That's good. I mean, that seemed to me incredibly positive. The failure of Putin's efforts seemed to me pretty good. There are things that are not terrible, and a bit of realism in British politics, that sounds good. Coming back, attempts to sort that out, that seems okay. I mean, I don't want to sound sort of Panglossian, but I think it is part of the point of. I think it is part of the duty of anyone who, as I do, spends a lot of time saying, this lot are pretty ridiculous, aren't they? Is to say, but that's not the only story, and that's not the end of the story.
Ian, towards the end of this year, obviously the World Cup in Qatar has kicked off.
Yes.
England going very well in the tournament, fantastically. Other people going less well in the tournament would probably be the migrant workers
Yes.
that built the stadiums.
The group of death, as Private Eye always puts them in.
Yes, they were very definitely in the group of death, or indeed some of the women in Qatar, or indeed any of the gay people in Qatar. Yes. Your thoughts, first of all, really, on the World Cup being there and how the tournament's gone so far?
Well, the fact that it was in Qatar is extraordinary, and we have repeatedly pointed this out. There was a wonderful journalist called Andrew Jennings who basically spent his life putting the boot into FIFA and pointing out how corrupt they were and how ludicrous this particular appointment of a very, very small non-football playing country that you have to move it to the middle of the winter because it's so hot there. I mean, everything about it, was corrupt and smelt, and that is extraordinary. But that said, and again, this is going to be me finding optimism, but the World Cup suddenly turned into a place where real stories were being played out, and I thought this was extraordinary. First, there was sort of the row over, whether you should take the Qataris' money, and I bumped into Gary Neville on Have I Got News for You, who hadn't seemed to entertain many of these dilemmas before. So I tried to help him with a few of them.
Do you think he honestly hadn't entertained or engaged with the concepts? He can't have been surprised by you asking him those questions.
I think he was, actually. I think the trouble about being very, very famous and people loving you is that nobody ever says, really? Not just any old broadcaster, the Qatari broadcaster. What, so you've made a documentary saying Qatar behaves very badly towards migrants, and then the state broadcaster says, would you like to come and have a huge amount of money? I mean, there is a conflict of interest. I mean, I was trying to say no more than that, but no, I don't think he'd thought this was going to happen. I think Gary Neville thought that no one would mention this, and if they did, it would just be sort of fairly light-hearted. And the subject came up, and I thought, well, this is a bit cosy. Why don't we just ask you what your defence is? And he didn't have one, and this is my footballing knowledge. I thought, brilliant, I've used the word defence. You see, that's pretty good. And then just nothing at all. Yeah. It was just like he sort of lay down and said, oh, here's the goal. I was slightly shocked that he didn't have anything. He said the situation was binary. You either made a fuss about human rights and did it while you were over there, or you stayed at home. And I said, well, you could stay at home and make a fuss about human rights while you were here. Again, which didn't strike me as being terribly sophisticated as an argument, but it hadn't occurred to him. We'd had a year where it's what you talk earlier about just people not noticing anything until they do. So the fact that the Saudis own Newcastle, despite having murdered Khashoggi, one of the journalists who fell foul of the prince. Yeah, that's all right. One of our major clubs owned by them. That seems okay. Anton Deck there. Hooray, the black and white people who are totally owned by the prince. I mean, that seemed to me fairly extraordinary, and we do much the same, with other figures. But suddenly, Qatar focused the minds. And then I really like the fact that you suddenly got this incredibly brave Iranian team refusing to sing their own national anthem because of the hijab protest. And you suddenly thought, hey, God, you're brave. Your families are literally at home. This isn't just putting on an armband. This is really important. And then lots of other countries' issues suddenly came to the fore. So people were making protests using football. And I think probably football purists would say, oh, they're mixing sport and politics. And I'm thinking, they're mixing sport and politics. This is really interesting. That
argument, it holds no water for me whatsoever, that sport and politics are these two separate things. They're inextricably linked. From the nature of football as a game, as a working class sport, all the way through to wherever you want to take it, at the highest level, the protest you mentioned about the World Cup, to try and suggest that politics has no place in sport, or that sport is irrelevant to politics. It's a nonsense argument in my eyes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's happened before. I mean, there was a Olympics where no one went at all because the Russians had invaded Afghanistan, and that was before we'd done the same thing. So obviously the next Olympics, that was a real problem.
It was,
shows how much anybody learnt.
Absolutely. Ian Hislop, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Private Eye Annual, available now. Go get it.